This is audio 7 of week 3, and we're continuing week 3. Let's try again. This is audio 7 of week 7, double 7, part 3 of week 7, audio 7, and we're continuing on slide 9. Now that I've got all the math straight. The Cultural Revolution began in Tibet almost as quickly as it did in the rest of China because orders were issued from Beijing to the gentleman you see here, whose picture you have seen before, Zhang Guohua. Zhang Guohua, you may recall, started off in 1950 as one of the two commanders of Chinese forces that invaded Tibet. He continued to be one of those commanders for several more years, and then he took over as the military commander and political commissar, I think, at the same time, of Tibet. And another man named Zhang Jingwu, was the head of the CCP committee, in other words, the top communist in Tibet. By the way, the person who's the head of the CCP committee for Tibet has always been an ethnic Han, or maybe somebody else, but has never been a Tibetan. Typically nowadays, the head of the CCP committee is not a Tibetan. The head of the government, which is supervised by the Communist Party, is an ethnic Tibetan. But anyway, by this time, Zhang Guohua was still in the military, but he had become the head of the CCP committee in Tibet as well. Zhang Jingwu had departed. And orders from Beijing reached Lhasa to initiate this Cultural Revolution thing, and the party committee here in Tibet reacts like party committees all over the country did. They decided, okay, Cultural Revolution, no problem. We can do one of those. We will have some requisite attacks on the right people and wind this up in a couple months. And so Zhang Guohua's people, it seems from the evidence, fabricated a Cultural Revolution. They had attacks made on the head of the Tibet daily newspaper, which meant that they retained control of the media, which was very important, of course. Propaganda being a core interest and a core business of the Communist Party. And they got people in the Lhasa Middle School and the Lhasa Teachers College to start criticizing 20 feudal practices that are listed in Shakya. If you take a look in there, you'll find those. And I don't have a list of them in front of me, but they included things like greeting people by sticking your tongue out, and respect for the Dalai Lama, and respect for the people in charge of your manorial estate, this sort of thing. Making regular visits to monasteries, giving up a son out of each family to serve in a monastery as a lama or as a monk. And by doing it this way, they thought they could wrap things up rather quickly. And there was no mention of the two-line struggle that was emerging as a major issue, which turned out to be a struggle between a rather one-sided fight between Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi that we looked at in the previous lectures. So it seems like it was very much controlled by Zhang Guohua. But then going on to slide 10, radical groups began to form because people became gradually more well-informed about what was going on in the rest of China, especially what was going on in Beijing. And when they did, there were people who were inclined, just like there were all over the rest of the country, there were people who were inclined toward radical left action. And they began to form Red Guard groups. One of the things they did immediately was to surround the home of Nabo, the man we've seen pictures of before, the man who was an official in the old Tibetan government, who surrendered early out in Kham in the east when the Chinese invaded. The man who is depicted in the 7 Years in Tibet movie as a complete traitor, who only gradually became a complete traitor, actually. But by this time, he was firmly in the pockets of the CCP. He was a member of the People's Liberation Army. He was a member of the Communist Party. And the Chinese absolutely wanted to protect him, so they had him flown out of Tibet. They had him evacuated immediately as soon as this little action by the nascent Red Guard movement was finished. But in December of 1966, people began to arrive from outside of Tibet, from inland China, as we were just talking about, from Zhongguo Neidi. People still say that, by the way, when they speak about the rest of China. And a radical left group formed right after Mao's birthday. Now, they should have formed it on December 26th, which is Boxing Day in Great Britain, but in China is Chairman Mao's birthday. Now, why were they 2 days late? That's what I'd like to know. I think there's a counter-revolutionary plot here to postpone things, but I'm just being silly. Sorry, it's late at night. So by this time, Zhang Guohua knew that things were getting out of hand. Going on to slide 11, these two Red Guard groups, one had 7,000 people, the left group, the Genlog, the other, the Namdrel, had 38,000. You'll see different spellings of these two, by the way, and it looks like I'm sure that I've made a mistake here somewhere, because Goldstein spells them both one way and Shakya spells them both another way. I don't know. I have not studied Tibetan enough to understand the romanization systems, but I think you'll get it if you just pay attention as you read through this stuff and as you look through the readings. So the Genlog were the leftists, the Namdrel were the conservatives who were defending the existing CCP committee and government in Tibet. They both, of course, as in other parts of China, they pledged eternal loyalty to Chairman Mao and an eternal death to their enemies, who must be Chairman Mao's enemies, even though they wave the red flag and say they aren't. But anyway, that's the way this sort of thing went all over China. Zhang Guohua, right at this time, was, for reasons that I think are not appreciated, probably still secret, was promoted right out of Lhasa over to Chengdu, off to the west, or rather to the east, and became the first political commissar in the Chengdu military region, an extremely important post. And he retained influence in Tibet. And it's not clear to me if that's for the reason that it would be today. Today, the Tibetan military district is under the Chengdu military region, but I don't know if it was the same back then. If it was the same back then that is a logical bureaucratic explanation. So at first, the PLA in Tibet stayed neutral, but the problem was that just like other army units, the PLA in Tibet was soon riven by factional problems and there were struggles inside between left and right, so to speak, in these units, and some of them joined the Genlog, and there was fighting in Lhasa. Going on to slide 12. So now the Cultural Revolution in Tibet entered its most violent phase. Beijing had to send in 2 divisions, which I believe in their system at the time was probably 24,000 troops, as the local garrison split between the left and the right. And it took about 6 months, but things were eventually settled inside the military. In May 1968, there was this terrible final battle in the Jokang, which is one of the major tourist attractions. If you go there today, it's in the downtown in Lhasa. It's in the Tibetan part of town. It's where the big market is. It's considered to be the most sacred temple in Tibet, the Jokang, and this is where this enormous battle took place. So the Genlog members fled to the countryside because, as you learned last week when we talked about the Dalai Lama fleeing Tibet for India, the PLA did not have complete control of every inch of the countryside. So there was this vacuum into which the defeated leftists could disappear. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Ngabo is being kept under, if not under lock and key, he's being kept in close protection, because Beijing knows that they're going to need him eventually to go back and settle things in Lhasa. And the Panchen Lama disappeared in 1964. The place he disappeared to was Beijing, and he was subjected to struggle by Red Guard groups. Going on to slide 13. So now we get into one of the most controversial, strange, and violent incidents of the entire Cultural Revolution, the Niemo Revolt, or Nimu in Chinese, the Nimu Revolt. This place, a farming area in a valley that's about halfway between Lhasa and Shigatse. You pass through it today if you take a car or a bus between those two cities, as many people do, as many foreigners do. And there was a crazy person who happened to be an oracle, that is, somebody who tells fortunes. Oracles had been attacked during the Cultural Revolution, and she was probably one of those who was attacked. Who knows if that contributed to her insanity or not? But she thought that the birds were giving her messages from the gods. She thought that she was hearing voices that told her to attack the Chinese. But what she decided to do, because she wasn't entirely crazy, she decided because people listened to her, because she was popular, she decided to oppose the Namdrel, because she believed that they were the ones who were really destroying Tibet. They after all, represented the authorities. So it's not unusual in human history to decide that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and it seems from the record that that's what she did. She joined with the Genlog and started to attack places that were held by the government, and the place that she chose to do this in the most famous and deadly of these incidents was in Niemo, where she killed 50 people, and who were all Chinese, in this small place that was an administrative capital for the county, and chopped off the hands of the Tibetans who sympathized with them. If you do enough trolling on the web, you can find pictures of people with no hands from this period. Going on to slide 14. So eventually she was caught. She went up into the hills to try to practice guerrilla warfare, and that worked for a little while, but not long. The PLA caught up with her and took her back to Lhasa, and here she is here in her final moments of life. Both Shakya and Goldstein, in this interesting book that is in our library, tell us that contrary to popular belief, this was not really any sort of nationalist struggle on the part of a Joan of Arc type figure who was attacking evil occupiers or anything like that. I'm sure there was plenty of evil to go around in this whole situation, but in reality, this was, as I just described it, I've tried to be as faithful as possible to both Goldstein and Shakya in describing this situation. This was an incident where somebody had literally lost their mind, and they happened to be a very popular and influential figure, leading people who were desperate and very angry, and probably very hungry as well. But the thing about this is that there were 40 incidents admitted to by Chinese historians, some of which may have been offbeat and very odd, like this one. Some of which may have actually been intended to defend religious practice. It's difficult to say. Religious practice at this point was pretty much outlawed. But they occurred all over Tibet, and the question that has, I think, not really been settled is to what extent these incidents reflected opposition to the Chinese, and to what extent these incidents just reflected the crazy violence of the Cultural Revolution. But nothing lasts forever. Going on to slide 15. Once the Gang of Four, so-called, was rounded up after the death of Mao Zedong, then everything started to change. And before that, of course, Mao Zedong had decided, as we've learned in the last 2 weeks, decided to close down the violent phase of the Cultural Revolution. And as we mentioned a little while ago, the developments in Tibet typically lagged a bit behind developments in China. While things were being calmed down in the rest of China, they were going crazy in this Niemo incident. But in 1971, 1972, things did begin to calm down to some extent. There was no reversal of policies at all. There was simply less chaos. There was, and when things like the Lin Biao affair and the anti-Confucius campaign, anti-Confucius, anti-Lin, anti-Dalai Lama, anti-Panchen Lama, came up, then officials followed instructions from Beijing and went through the motions and did what they needed to do, but they didn't actually go around attacking Tibetans or anything like that. Going on to slide 16. So once Mao Zedong died, there was a rather sudden shift, not so much in how things were done, but in easing up on access to Tibet for people at a high level, for very few people. The thing that occurred immediately was that the U.S. Defense Secretary visited Tibet while he was visiting China. He didn't just go there to visit Tibet. And there began to be discussions with the Dalai Lama's people about eventually entering into negotiations. And indeed, once Deng Xiaoping was in control, things did start to happen. The Panchen Lama appeared in public for the first time since 1964. He didn't go back to Tibet for about another 2 years. I think it was 1980 when he finally went back and made a visit to Tibet. He was still being kept in Beijing, but he was now seen in public, and this gave, along with his appointment to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, you remember them, from 1949, everybody raising their hands all at once. His appointment to that body signaled a policy of change toward minorities and toward non-communist people in society as well. Going on to slide 17, and so the stage was set for some genuine change. This photograph on the bottom here, well, on the top you see the Potala, the Dalai Lama's winter palace. It still looks like that today, except that's an old photograph that shows the village of Seoul down below that's now been replaced by a big people's square, sort of a mini Tiananmen Square. That's the place where sadistic guides like to take you when you haven't been in Tibet longer than 24 hours, walking up those steps and you're already sick from lack of oxygen. Yes, revenge is sweet upon the West. So here you see Hu Yaobang, who is second from the right there. He became, we'll talk about him more next week. He, at this point, was the general secretary of the party, working under Deng Xiaoping. And he is making a visit to Tibet. He is touring the Potala, the residence of the Dalai Lama, former residence of the Dalai Lama. An impossible idea, even a few years before. But by doing this, he is demonstrating that the time has come for reconciliation between the Tibetans and the Chinese, and indeed, there were negotiations that were entered into with Dharamsala, with the Tibetan government in exile, and 3 delegations visited Tibet, including one that had as a member Jetsun Pema, who is the Dalai Lama's sister. And the Chinese thought they really had the Tibetans in a corner, but it turned out that the Dalai Lama's people, when they toured around Tibet, both the Tibetan Autonomous Region and the peripheral areas of ethnographic Tibet, it turned out that, oh my goodness, they're awfully popular. Thousands of people come out to see them. They crowd up to these delegates from Dharamsala, telling them about all the awful things that have happened in their absence. And this turns out to be a little bit more than what the PRC government bargained for. However, they did believe that they needed the Dalai Lama's assistance to reestablish their influence in Tibet, and they decided to go ahead and try to negotiate. Next week, we will talk about how those negotiations fared and how they ultimately failed. And of course, we will get into what was happening in the rest of the PRC, the events that led up to the 1989 June 4th Tiananmen massacre. More next week. Study hard. Get enough sleep. Stay off those computer screens. And have a great day.